This is Captioning 101, and I know that many of you here, can someone send me a chat and let me know that you can hear me? Anyway, this is Captioning 101, and I know that you've been sitting through a variety of sessions around captioning over the last day and a half or so, and this is really just the basics. We're just going to get down to the very fundamental pieces of captioning and what you need to know. And we're scheduled here for an hour, but I'm not going to take that entire time. I'll probably talk 30 or 40 minutes, 45 at the most, and then leave time for questions. So if you have questions, I really want to make sure that we set that time aside so that if there's questions or discussion, things that you think people need to know, then we have time to make sure you get the information that you need. So here's what we're going to cover. What is captioning? Just at a really fundamental level, what is it? Different captioning methods, making sure that we get quality captions, requesting captioning, some tips around that. How do you know that you're going to, what you ask for is what you're going to get? And then we'll leave time, as I said, for questions. So a little bit about me. My name is Carlascio. I'm an ADA coordinator, and I'm the founder and president of Strada Communications. And a little bit about my background. I grew up in a religious community, a church where we had sign language interpreters and a group of deaf attendees. And so I learned to, I became a sign language interpreter very early. I started interpreting at church at 16. And I interpreted on and off over the past 25 years or so. I no longer am a practicing interpreter since I'm busy managing Strada. And as I was an interpreter, I was also, during that time, the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services coordinator at Portland State University for a short time. So during that time is when it really hit me that transcription and captioning services, I really saw a shift in how, especially in the educational field, students were, what kind of services they were requesting. So moving more towards seeing more English-based and captioning services being requested, especially as kids are being implanted younger and younger with cochlear implants, then that moves a lot of people towards captioning and using maybe less sign language as a choice. So when I saw that, then that's when I became trained as a typo transcriber and then set up Strada. And so Strada, we provide sign language interpreting, CART and typo, which we'll talk about later, and also accessible text. So we make text books and other printed materials accessible for people with low vision. So we're really a communication access agency, and that's what we really focus on. So today we're going to talk about captioning, and I just thought at a very fundamental level, there's lots of conversation about what is captioning. And so here's my stab at it, and I've done some research over the last few weeks, especially in getting prepared for this. And so what is captioning? Captions capture audio content and as written text. So as you're viewing the captioning pod now, or you might be viewing the typo transcript, typo as it's coming through, it's capturing what I'm saying and giving it to you as a written text. So when we're talking about audio content, we'll talk about spoken dialogue as a lecture or a presentation as I'm giving, narration, maybe you're watching a documentary and you see the narrator, speaker identifiers, music description, sometimes you see lyrics, environmental cues, and sound effects. Captions provide access to communication because they appear at a near instantaneously with whatever, and in the line of sight of whatever they're accompanying, whether it's a speaker, a video, slides, or other visual content. And one comment I want to make here is that a transcript, like a frozen transcript, is not the same as captions, and it does not meet the requirement, or it does not provide access to communication. It's static. It might tell you what is said, but it doesn't indicate where it's said or how it relates to the visual content. So sometimes we see people provided or offered a transcript in lieu of captions as a way to provide communication access, or people think that they're equivalent or meets their legal requirement around access, and it really doesn't. And so as a coordinator or a consumer, that's something that you need to also keep in mind, and you know, don't settle for that if that's what's being offered. So where do we see captions? Movie theaters, so some of them have open captions. They may use devices like Rear Window or caption glasses. We see it on video content online. VHS, if any of you remember VHS tapes, DVDs. So on these, they may be either listed as closed captions or subtitles. Sometimes they're called subtitles for the hearing impaired, and so they're labeled different things. Webinars like we're having right now. Meetings, large or small meetings, so it could be a one-on-one meeting with a boss or a colleague in a classroom, conferences. We're seeing more and more captioning done for live theater, concerts, and sporting events. So it's great. We're seeing a real increase in access there. So here's a few terms that I thought as we're working our way through the material that it would be helpful for you to have, because especially if you're one requesting captioning or dealing with coordinating captioning, there's some distinctions that I think are useful. So broadcast captioning, you'll hear that, and that's used for television, and it can be live, such as the news, or pre-recorded. So most of your shows that you see, your regular series, those are pre-recorded, and those are not done by a live transcriber as it's happening. So the news is usually somebody somewhere listening to that news feed and transcribing it or captioning it as it happens. Media captioning is post-production, so after the video or the film is done, then it has to be transcribed or captioned. Sometimes we see that with recorded webinars and other kinds of video content that's online. Real-time captioning, so we're going to talk about some variation here. Real-time captioning is CART, which is the most familiar to you probably, Typewell C-Print. And we find these at live events, so conferences, classrooms, meetings, right? And we'll talk about the differences between those. Verbatim, so another thing that will be, another distinction that we'll make is not just where captions happen, or but the method behind them. So verbatim captioning, which is CART or voice writing, their intention there is to capture every word, and their accuracy is measured in how many words they accurately captured per minute. So meaning for meaning transcription or captioning, it captures all of the spoken content and it puts it down into grammatically correct sentences. So it also captures environmental cues, vocal intonation, and other meaningful audio input. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as text interpreting. So some of the examples that we'll talk about are C-Print or Typewell. So where do captions happen, or how do they happen? So on-site captions, so if you happen to be in a meeting or in a classroom, some kind of live event, it's very likely that the captioner, the CART provider, or the transcriber is there with you in the room. And for you as a recipient of those captions, or for someone who's accessing that, the captions are viewed on a laptop, a tablet, a smartphone. Sometimes they're projected onto a large screen for a large group of people. And And so that's pretty simple. There's not a lot that you have to do in order to access those. And usually there's not a lot of complications in making sure that those are accessible. For remote captions, like we have today, there's another complication or some other things that we need, right? So we need to have a reliable internet connection. We need to have a quality audio feed. So one of the things is that somebody in the room oftentimes hears more of what's happening than somebody who's listening via a phone or a internet feed, right? So that's not always true, but often it's true. And then you need to have a laptop or a smartphone, that a tablet that can connect to the internet to read that feed. So just like you're watching the stream text feed or the typo feed on your device, whether it's a computer, you might be on an iPad or your smartphone viewing or watching this, this presentation, that's how you get remote captions in all instances. So what's the process for producing captions? They kind of magically appear on our television or on our computer, but there's a person involved in quality captions. There's a person involved. So we're not to the point yet where you can put a microphone in front of someone and have a software transcribe it accurately. We're getting closer to that, but those really work only under specific kind of circumstances and aren't really viable for the kinds of everyday access that we need to have. So the process to what the captioner or the transcriber is doing, what's the process for them? So they have to listen to what's said or heard. They have to understand it. They have to retain it. They have to be able to accurately reproduce it. They have to quickly transcribe, and this requires that they have good ergonomics and typing speed. So they have to monitor their output for accuracy, and then if they make mistakes, they have to be able to correct it on the fly without getting behind. So I put together this little image here because I think it helps us to look at what's really happening. So as we have a cart provider today, and as that person is listening to what I'm saying, they're listening, they have to understand what I'm saying, comprehend it, they have to retain it to a certain degree, and then they have to be able to reproduce it. She has to be able to type really fast, make sure that the output is accurate, and then if she makes a mistake, she has to correct it on the fly. She's doing all of this at the same time while she's still listening to what's being said. And the average rate of speech is 125 to 150 words a minute. So that's a lot that is going on in here that they're having to process. So they're having to do all of this and still not get behind in what's being said. So it requires a lot of focus, a lot of attention, a good working memory. Of course, your ergonomics come into play there. And also they need to be proficient with their equipment and their software. So there's a lot that goes into producing quality captions. So we want to be really, appreciative of all the hard work that goes into that. When you have a remote situation like we have today, not only do we have the captioner, the cart provider doing all of this on top of this, but then we've mixed in all of the technology and all the breakdowns that can happen there too, right? So I thought this was useful just as a visual for people, as you might be wondering, well, how do remote captions work, or how is that different? You have to still have to have a reliable internet and an audio source, and you can use any kind of device you want. And then as long as you have a good internet and audio source and a working device, you'll be able to access the captions. So it's a little bit of a layer on top of, it's very similar to what happens in an actual, if you're on site, if the person's in the room with you, but then there's just another little layer of activity that happens as connecting to the internet here. So that's what that looks like. What goes into training, or how does somebody become a captioner or a voice writer or a transcriber? How does somebody provide captioning? So there's a few different options. So CART captioners, their intention here is to produce a verbatim or a near verbatim transcript, and they use a stenography machine, and specialized software. So they usually have attended a court reporting program at a community college or a legal arts school. Their abbreviations, they have a whole theory that they go through. Their abbreviations are based on phonetics, and their association, the NCRA, the National Court Reporting Association, is over 100 years old. So court reporting is a very established profession. And so CART captioner come out of that training and then have additional training that allows them to provide captioning in real time, because court reporters are not actually providing communication access, they're providing a legal document. So that's one distinction there between court reporting and CART providers or CART captioners, is that they're not providing communication access. CART captioners have to have some additional training in order for them to be able to transition the skills they have as a court reporter into providing real-time access. It's a little bit of an adjustment to how they previously worked. It requires a little bit different skill set. Again, there's a lot going on that they have to mentally process and listen to so that they can be sure that they're providing accurate captions and correcting any mistakes if there are any. The next option that we see as far as people who are training to provide or are providing captioning, which is are voice writers. So the goal of voice writers is to produce verbatim or near verbatim transcripts, and they do this by re-speaking into a face mask. They use speech-to-text software such as Dragon Speech Naturally, and there's some other variations. And their association is the National Verbatim Reporter Association, and it's been established since 1967. So we see as technology has moved, then the method for providing captions has also, there's a new method then. Typewell transcribers and C-print providers, their intention is to produce a meaning-for-meaning transcript using a QWERTY keyboard, so just your regular laptop, and specialized software. And the Typewell in particular was started in 1999, and the National Association for Transcribers and Speech-to-Text Providers was established just this last year. So again, moving into another option as technology and software have kept pace. So you can see why when you mention captioning that people automatically, the default really is CART providers. And that's because, one, it's the most established. It was sort of the standard practice for many years. And it wasn't really until the 70s that they started using court reporters and moving them into classrooms and providing CART or real-time captioning. So really it hasn't been that long, just the last 40 years or so that or probably less than that they've been doing that. And then voice writers are newer than that, and then Typewell transcribers. So we see some differences, and this is why I wanted to go through this, because it may make a difference to you, or if you're a coordinator, it may make a difference to you what method that you choose. One thing I wanted to go through real quick before I forgot was that kind of comparing the training. So I went over the methods here a little bit, but wanted to go over some of the training, the differences between these three. So the research I did, the court reporters, they come out of the court reporting programs or the Legal Arts College, and their programs are usually around 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And with voice writers, the programs are much shorter. They're 9 months long. So makes a difference. And with CART captioners, because they're using the stenography equipment and the specialized court reporting software, their equipment costs are between $10,000 and $12,000 on top of whatever they paid for school. For voice writers, their equipment costs are between $3,000 and $4,000, and their training time is much less. With there's more and more voice writing programs coming out, and there's still a lot of court reporting programs that are in place. Court reporters or the CART captioners can generally they measure their accuracy by words per minute, and so it's 200 to 260 words per minute. Some can be a little bit quicker than that. And with voice writers, it's 180 to 260 words per minute. So if you remember, I said back a few slides ago that the average rate of speech is 125 to 150 words a minute. And we know that we have people who are fast talkers. We also know some people that are slower, but clearly they can capture every word, and that's their goal. And they do that with the software that they're using. In each case really makes the difference. With typo transcribers, the training for them is around 3 months for their initial training, and they use also a specialized software. Typo is a specialized software, and it comes with a dictionary of over 500,000 words. And one of the main differences between typo and CART and voice writers is that with typo, that dictionary is already in there, and the method that they're using to access it is a type of shorthand, abbreviation based on spelling. So one thing with CART writers and voice writers is they have to build their dictionary. And especially with CART providers, their dictionaries can be very specialized based on their own experience. So it's difficult for one CART provider to use the equipment or the software of another one because they have their own ways of doing that, and they have to build those dictionaries. With typo transcribers, producing a transcript or accessing that that dictionary through the keyboard, because it's based on spelling, there's a standardized way. So for the most part, people can use each other's equipment, and I won't get too technical into some of that, but it makes it a much more cost-effective method of training people to provide that kind of access. The way that typewell transcribers capture the same level of accuracy as CART captioners or voice writers is because they're producing a meaning-for-meaning transcript and using abbreviation techniques that are special to typewell. So this means, brings us to the next slide, as really a lot of this is fundamentally the same, right? So people are having to listen to what's being said, having to recognize it, understand it, reproduce it. Goes back to the slide we saw, this slide here. All of the cart providers, the voice writers, the typo transcribers, they're all going through this same process here, capturing spoken content and making sure that the product are accurate captions. So how do you choose, what difference does it make, or how do you choose one over the other? As I said, if you ask for captioning, the default is cart because it's been around for so long, and verbatim. So many people feel that verbatim transcripts or verbatim captions are the best because it captures all of the words, right? So that brings us to the next section here on choosing a captioning service. So what are the differences, and how do we know which to pick? So if you've been watching both the cart and the typo streams, you can see that there's a lot of similarities and maybe some differences. And so it really comes down to you know, what your preference is and what the environment is. So there are certain times when cart is really the best option, and there are certain times when typo is probably really the best option. So let's kind of talk about how do we compare these in a fair way so that we can really have some fundamental understanding of what we're asking for. So as I said before, cart captioning, the goal of it is to produce a verbatim or a word-for-word transcript. So that means that everything that's said is written exactly the way it was said. So cart providers do not generally alter the transcript. What they hear is typed into their software, and it appears exactly as we say it. Now, hearing people do not speak grammatically correct English. So if you've ever watched captions on your TV or on the news, or maybe even during a meeting or a presentation, and you had to stop and look at the caption and wonder, what does that really mean? It might be because the way we speak English is not the way we write English. And so when we go to read it, there's a little bit of a processing delay in having to figure out what did that really mean. And so one of the differences between carts and typewell is that because typewell transcribers, their goal is to capture all of the content of what is said in complete and grammatically correct English sentences. So this is why it is not a verbatim or a word-for-word transcript, and yet it can capture all of the content and meaning of what is said. So just like sign language interpreters listen to a language and use one language, listen to English and produce grammatically correct sign language, so too typewell transcribers listen to spoken English and transcribe it into grammatically correct written English. So that makes a big difference in what your transcripts look like. The other thing with typewell transcribers is that they're looking, because they're not looking for verbatim, they're looking for the meaning and the content. There will be certain things that you will see in a cart transcript that you won't see in a typewell transcript. So, for example, you would not see a lot of stammers and stutters, word whiskers that would get in the way of a grammatically correct sentence. So there are certain things, certain differences. The other thing is that cart captioning was not designed for the educational environment, and it wasn't necessarily designed specifically for communication access. So the way that you see things sometimes, the formatting is different. So sometimes you'll see cart captioners who write in all capital letters, or who don't use very much white space, or other things like that. With typewell transcription, there's a real emphasis on communication access. So there's an emphasis on using white space. The font is a special font that they've chosen for ease of use, for ease of reading on your eyes. And there's also the emphasis of making sure to include all of the auditory, verbal, and social cues within a situation. Sometimes things will be bolded or italicized to provide vocal cues. So there's a much more, and it was specifically designed for communication access, particularly in the educational environment. And it started there, but it has, you know, much broader applications. So these are, as you're thinking about captions, whether you're thinking about them for yourself or as a coordinator, these are options that you have that will be important to know what is appropriate or what is preferred. And so since the outcome of these two methods are very similar, what are some of the things that you might want to think about as you're making your choice? Some of the things that you might want to think about is how technical is the information? Is it something that's medical, legal, or sometimes very heavy jargon? If that's the case, then CART is always the best option, especially in medical or legal school where people are tested and have to know very specific knowledge, very specific terminology, then those are really important places to have CART. Very technical conferences, or if you work in a very technical environment, then CART is probably going to be the best solution. If that's not the case, then Typewell is an excellent choice. Also, for things, even math and science are very good in Typewell because they have a specialized math mode. Some other things to consider when for yourself or if you're coordinating captions is about the consumer. Who's the one that's going to be using the captioning? Does the consumer read and comprehend English easily? If so, if they have a really high reading comprehension, then CART or Typewell are equally good choices. If not, then Typewell might be better. And the reason for that is that it produces an easy-to-read transcript, and the reading requirement for accessing captions there is a 5th grade reading level. And that's because it's in grammatically correct English, and because the transcribers are trained to listen to what's said and to transcribe it for meaning without all of the false starts and verbal clutter that we find in verbatim transcripts. Sometimes people who have a lower English reading level or even a cognitive or an auditory processing problem, CART may be great for them, but it also, because it's not grammatically correct English, if they have some kind of auditory or cognitive processing delay, then that may add more delay because they're trying to figure out how the caption is, what it really means. So that's, again, where Typewell comes into play, or the meaning for meaning transcript that comes into play, where it has more white space, a different font choice, and the grammatically correct English. Also, when you're looking at services or options for captioning, then cost is a consideration. And CART is a well-established service, and so it is a more expensive service. We talked briefly about the cost of equipment and software, and so CART providers are very well trained. You know, they've gone through several years of school and have very expensive equipment and software, so their service naturally costs more. With Typewell and Cprint, because the software is different and the equipment required to provide the service is more affordable, then the cost of the service is less. So, and it all depends on it all depends on the quality of, or the level of availability in your area that also determines some of that too, right? So one of the things that we want to consider is if you're asking for captioning, what are some of the things that you want to make sure that you ask for? And so how do you know, if you've decided one way or the other what kind of captions you want, what kind of information needs to go, do you need to provide? So let's see here. There we go. So some of the tips, and people may already be familiar with this, but some of the tips are make sure you request it in advance. Make sure that you've decided what kind of captioning you want. If you just say, I need captioning, people will default to cart. Sometimes maybe that might not be available and they might be offering you typewall and you might not know that. So hopefully they will, whoever you're talking to or is coordinating that for you, will make that information available to you and is not trying to pass one off as the other. Some of the important information that we need when we're coordinating services are the dates, start and end times, the event type, if it's a conference or a meeting or a class, the content, is it technical or is it sort of, you know, is it a coding conference or is it something that's a history conference or a psychological conference? So the content of the material really makes a difference. How many people are going to be there? If it's a meeting, is it just going to be 1 or 2 people? Is it going to be a lot of people? And then providing prep material. This is really important if you're a coordinator or somebody who is receiving captioning as a service. It's really important that the captioning provider or the agency or whoever is providing the service has the ability to review what is going to be presented ahead of time. Handouts, PowerPoint slides, vocabulary. This is especially true with CART providers because if there's specialized vocabulary that they need to know, they have to build that into their dictionary. So there's a little bit of prep that needs to happen there. So those are the things that need to be given, the information that people need in order to be able to provide good services. And it's not a comprehensive list, but it is certainly a step in the right direction to make sure that you're getting the kind of level of service that you really deserve and need to have. So all of these things, as we've reviewed here, go into this is just a kind of a fundamental review of captioning and what the options are. I didn't talk much about broadcast captioning or the post-production captioning because I didn't want this to be too technical, and those could be entire presentations all on their own. And I wanted to be able to make sure that we left enough time for people and their questions or discussion. If anybody has anything that they want to add or specific questions that they want to have answered. And I'm going to see if I can go in here and make sure that I can see either the Q&A or any questions that anybody has. So someone asked, is C-print and typewall considered separate from or a kind of CART? My understanding was that CART is the umbrella term for real-time captioning that encompasses verbatim, steno, and meaning-for-meaning transcription. That's an excellent, so that was Chad, and I don't know how to say your last name, Chad. I apologize for that. But that's an excellent question, and the answer to that is that when I talk about captioning, I use that captioning as the umbrella term. Because remember the definition I gave for captioning was capturing audio content as written text. And so that's very broad, right? And with Typewell and cPrint, the acronym for CART is Communication Access Real Time. But that's very specific to people who have been trained as court reporters and who are now providing CART captioning. And they're very protective of that as referring very much to verbatim transcripts. So I would say that captioning is really the umbrella term versus CART, because CART in general, if you spoke to most people, would refer to the verbatim version. And oftentimes you'll hear Typewell or cPrint referred to as text interpreting, because, as I said, they're taking that spoken English and transcribing it or interpreting it into grammatically correct English. So there is a little bit of a transformation that happens there. But as far as CART being something that refers to Typewell, it would not be accurate, and I don't think Typewell would say that that was an accurate reference, and I really don't think that the CART providers would say that's accurate. There's really more of a distinction there. Someone asked, could I state again what the accuracy and speed rates are for CART writers and other kinds of speech-to-text providers? So that's Dana. Yeah, so the research that I did, I can go back and repeat that for you. Let me just look that up. So with CART providers using a stenography machine, a stenograph, and their specialized software, the accuracy is 90 to 99%, and the speed is 200 to 260 words per minute. And I think that there's probably some, there may be people who could do more or less, but in general, that's a general range. And then for voice writers, the way that they measure accuracy is words per minute, and it's 180 to 260 words per minute. So they're revoicing that. With Typewell, the way that we measure accuracy with Typewell is not words per minute, because it is not verbatim. We measure it in the accuracy of how much content was captured. So we want to make sure, because a lot of things, like I just kind of stammered there for a minute and stuttered, right? So that was not really meaningful utterance, and it contained no real content. But it will show up probably on the verbatim transcript, and it may or may not show up on the Typewell transcript. And so the way we measure accuracy with Typewell is how much of the content, what percentage of the content did you get? Now, if you look at the accuracy rates for both CART and voice writing, they say they get 90 to 99% of the words spoken. So that's up to 10% inaccuracy. Now, if you think about all of the words that I've said, and you take out 10%, it really makes a difference what 10% is missing. If you take out the wrong 10%, really a lot of what I would say would not make much sense. You wouldn't get the content of what I was saying. So that's why with Typewell, they really focus on how much, not so much the words, how many words did you get, but did you get all the content? Did you get all the meaning of what was being said? Did you put it down in grammatically correct English so that it is easily understood and can be quickly read? And so that's the differences in looking at the content and the accuracy. So don't be put off by the fact that TypeWell is not giving you words per minute per se, but is really, the goal there is really to capture all of the content and meaning of what is being said. So that's what's really, really important. We still have a few minutes left. Does anyone have any other questions or concerns or anything that they would like to have addressed in particular?
Hi, this is GZ. I was wondering, just out of curiosity, do you see many people move from or progress from, say, doing cPrint or TypeWell into CART or the other direction? Like, is it possible for people to build some basic skills, start finding employable work, and then build upon that and get involved more full-time, or are they pretty different from each other and they don't scaffold well?
Well, so there's a couple questions in there, and one is, do we ever see people move from TypeWell into CART? And I would say no, and the reason for that is the methods are very different. The methods are very different, and also the people who are recruiting TypeWell providers, because the training time for TypeWell providers is much shorter, you know, they're usually sponsored into that. And there's plenty of work for TypeWell providers out there. At this point in time, they're mostly in the educational field, so it is seasonal, but there is a high demand for it. And the other thing is that with CART, it's a much longer process. As I said, it's, you know, 2 or 3 years in a program, and then they have to, you know, get up to speed. Plus, there's some additional training that usually has to happen in order for them to move from the court reporting sort of mode into CART. The access for it is also much more expensive. So you have all the expense of the court reporting program, plus the equipment and the software. So the access to that is kind of a block. With TypeWell, as I said, it's a much easier, it's easier to get into it. And I will say that TypeWell's training is very robust, so that people who come out of TypeWell are able to function well coming right out of it. And it's because of the type of training that they do and the type of software they have. And it's the way that they teach people to process information in a very different way. It's very much related to how sign language interpreters sort of chunk information, and not that they're leaving information out, but they may use expansion or contraction techniques in order to put in or add, not add, but to make things more clear for meaning. And like I said too, hearing people say a lot of unnecessary words, we repeat things, we have word whiskers, and so those are kinds of things that as they're dropped out or left out of the transcript because they're not meaningful, open up room for capturing that real content. I see Dana has a question about how is performance of TypeWell or cPrint measured. And so I'm not sure if that's a question around certification or how do we know that people are providing quality services. For us at Strada, we have a process, and we're just reviewing it now even to enhance it, of, you know, doing real-time observations, testing people as far as their performance, and making sure that they're capturing content. So they go through a pretty rigorous training process through Typewell and Cprint, and then they have to complete a performance exam before they're allowed to provide services. I can't speak much to Cprint because we have only pretty much used and trained Typewell providers. Cprint providers produce good work. I can't speak to the level of their training. So I'm not sure if that, Dana, answered your question or not. And then also Typewell and Cprint, there's a new association for speech-to-text providers, and that is looking at and trying to set up some certification. So kind of following the lead of the NCRA and the Verbatim Reporter Association and RID, making sure that people are qualified to do their jobs, right? Katie asked, what are word whiskers? So sometimes people maybe they say a lot, well, you know, so there's certain things that people say over and over as they're trying to buy time and the way that they think, or certain patterns that they have in the way that they speak, which they don't contain actual information. If you see them written out in a verbatim transcript, especially if somebody says a lot, well, I don't know, you know, it's difficult, sometimes it's difficult to even listen to it if somebody's saying it a lot. And then reading it is also, can also be hard. So that's one example, or maybe somebody says a lot. So those are examples of word whiskers. Did that answer your question? Steve Jacobs says, what are the differences in cost between the different methods of captioning? That's a great question, Steve. So my experience is that with CART providers, what you'll pay for them, if you were contracting with them directly or with an agency, it's going to be between $100 and $150 an hour, and it depends. There's some variations there on where it's happening and why, and sometimes people charge more if it's projected rather than just a small group. So there's all those kinds of things. With Typewell and Cprint, I can only speak to Typewell, and I can say that it's about half of what CART is. So, and it also, though, depends, I would say, on where it's happening. So educational versus business, or in a social services setting. So probably for Typewell, you'll be looking at between $50 and $100 for Typewell services. So, and voice writers all fall around that same range too. And I can't speak to those directly necessarily because we haven't used a lot of voice writers, and we haven't. That's not something that we've mostly been using Typewell and CART. So that's what I can speak to on those. We have a few, 1 or 2 minutes left. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, then thank you for attending this session. And oh yeah, Carla, that is price per hour. Those prices are per hour. So those will be the prices. Yeah. If you don't have any other questions or comments, thank you very much for attending this session. I believe it will be recorded, and you can replay it. And then you're free to contact me later if you need help or have further questions or anything else. If it's something I can't answer, then I'm happy to refer you to someone who can. So thanks very much for your attendance, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.